What kind of kingdom lets its queen die alone, in silence, and forgets to bury her? That question still hangs over Stirling Castle, not in marble, not in memory, but in the frost that clings to the stone corridors where no one walks anymore. They say she died in winter, but the truth is she began fading long before the snow fell. She was vanishing in plain sight. A queen, not overthrown, not murdered, but quietly erased by the very people who once bowed at her feet. They did not kill her. They just stopped knocking. Margaret of Denmark was found days after she died, her body stiff, seated on a narrow bench beside a cold hearth. In her hands, she clutched something soft. It was a child's tunic, faded, woolen, worn thin with time. Her eyes were open. There was no scream, no candle left burning, only the whisper of what had once been royal breath, now trapped in stone. There were no guards outside her chamber, no physician summoned, no priest called. She did not vanish. She was left behind, forgotten while still alive. How does a queen, born to unite two nations, die without a witness? She had been married into power, promised to a throne before she could speak her husband's language, crowned for peace, not for passion. She fulfilled her duty, gave Scotland an heir, then slipped into the background, where all dutiful women are expected to disappear. But even the walls remember what men choose to forget. At Stirling, no one heard her last breath, because no one came to listen. She was born beneath a gray sky and a crown that was never truly hers. Margaret, daughter of Christian I of Denmark, entered the world not with cries of celebration, but with the silence of strategy. Her birth was noted not for its joy, but for its value. From the moment her mother held her to her chest, Margaret was a vessel, a bearer of peace, alliance, and northern ambition. The court at Copenhagen was not a place for softness. It was cold, not from the weather alone, but from the precision of its rituals. Margaret grew up among stiff collars and long corridors, her footsteps muffled by heavy tapestries and heavier expectations. Her tutors trained her not in wonder, but in warfare of another kind. She was taught how to sit, how to listen, how to never interrupt, when to lower her gaze, and when to lift her chin just enough to remind a man that she, too, carried royal blood. By the time she was 10, her name was already being whispered in other courts. Her father, Christian, ruled not only Denmark but also Norway and parts of Sweden. A powerful monarch, yet always restless. His ambitions needed bridges, not battles. And Margaret, quiet and obedient, became the strongest bridge he could offer. Scotland had been bleeding for years, warring with England, feuding within itself, held together by fragile threads of loyalty and the ever-shifting mood of its nobles. King James III needed more than stability. He needed legitimacy, a wife with a crown of her own, a wife with a dowry rich enough to buy silence from enemies and favor from allies. The arrangement was swift. Margaret was barely 11 when the negotiations began. She was 13 when they were finalized. No one asked her if she was ready. No one asked her anything at all. The marriage was not about readiness. It was about kingdoms. The terms were generous. Scotland would receive the Orkney and Shetland Islands as part of the dowry. In return, Denmark would gain a daughter queen seated beside the Scottish throne, a symbol, a treaty in flesh and bone, Her wedding dress was stitched not for beauty, but for diplomacy. White silk to represent peace. Blue thread for the North Sea that divided her from home. She sailed away in silence. The docks were crowded with onlookers, but no one cried out her name. Her mother stood wrapped in furs, holding a handkerchief pressed tight to her lips. Her father watched from a high window. Margaret never turned back to wave. Her spine remained straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had been taught not to tremble. The sea was cruel, the journey cold. Her arrival in Scotland was not greeted with celebration, but with inspection. The court of James III was tense, filled with whispers. A foreign girl, too young, too pale, too Danish. She did not speak their language fluently. Her accent clung to every word like snow on stone. They dressed her in tartans she did not understand, fed her stews that burned her throat, assigned her a lady-in-waiting who spoke no Danish and did not care to learn. Every lesson she had memorized in Copenhagen suddenly felt useless. Here, her grace was foreign, her posture misunderstood as pride, her silence mistaken for coldness. The king was older than she expected, thin-lipped, with eyes that scanned instead of seeing. Their first meeting was short. He nodded once. She curtsied, knees steady. They exchanged no words, only glances. And then the ceremony began. The wedding was held in a stone chapel thick with incense and expectation. Latin chants echoed against the vaulted ceiling, though she understood only fragments. Her gown trailed behind her like a banner of surrender. When the archbishop placed the crown upon her head, she did not look at her husband. She looked toward the altar and tried to imagine her mother's face. She was 14, a child in silk, a queen in name, and a stranger in both language and bed. The celebrations were brief. Scotland could not afford indulgence. And Margaret, delicate and foreign, was not the bride they had longed for. She was not of their blood. Her presence reminded them of debt, of politics, of fragile peace. The nobles watched her closely. The servants whispered. Even the maids took turns testing the edges of her silence. James did not visit her often. When he did, it was with stiffness, as if fulfilling an obligation carved into treaty. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were weighed more than felt. Margaret responded in measured nods, in small gestures of grace. She did not ask for affection. She had been taught that duty mattered more than desire. Over time, she learned the rhythms of the castle, which corridors creaked, which faces to trust. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she was allowed to question, and slowly, the Queen of Scotland became a shadow moving between tapestries and candlelight. But in that shadow, she endured. She began to write letters to her siblings in Denmark, though replies came rarely. She kept a small box of keepsakes beneath her pillow, a dried flower, a torn page from a Danish book, a handkerchief embroidered with the letter M. These became her anchors, her reminders that somewhere beyond the mist, there had been a childhood. Years passed, and she grew into her role. She walked beside the king during public appearances. She stood with grace at ceremonies. She bore the weight of the crown without flinching. The people began to warm to her, if only slightly. They praised her modesty, her calm, her ability to remain still through storms. But they did not know the silence was not virtue. It was survival, and then she became pregnant. For the first time since she arrived, the castle began to call her queen. It was not in the way of adoration or affection, but in the tone of necessity. Margaret had fulfilled the most sacred duty of a royal wife. She had given Scotland an heir, a boy, healthy, crying, and red-faced in the midwinter frost. They named him James. And suddenly, her presence became more than symbolic. It became vital. The bells of Edinburgh rang for days. Nobles rode from distant counties to pay tribute. Priests blessed her name in Sunday sermons. The queen, who once walked silent corridors, now moved with a different gravity. She had become the mother of a future king. Paintings were commissioned. In one, she is seated beside a cradle draped in white, her hands resting gently on the rim. Her hair is woven with pearls, her eyes steady, her expression calm. The child sleeps in the folds of embroidered silk. Viewers see serenity, but no one sees what is missing. No crown on her head, no husband by her side. James III was there in name, but rarely in presence. He acknowledged the birth, gave the necessary gifts, attended the required mass, yet he kept his distance. Not just from Margaret, but from the child. He was a man entangled in shadows, distrustful, absorbed by whispers of betrayal, obsessed with foreign policy, coinage, and control. Margaret did not question it. She had learned long ago that silence was safer than inquiry. Instead, she focused on her son. She kept him close, chose his wet nurse herself, oversaw his garments, spoke to him in Danish when they were alone, her voice softer than anyone at court had ever heard it. For a time, the court bloomed around her. Ladies sought her favor. Lords invited her opinions. Her name was spoken with a cautious kind of respect. She hosted dinners, attended councils, received foreign dignitaries with elegance and measured charm. The people called her wise. The clergy called her modest. The nobles, at last, began to listen when she spoke. It was the closest she ever came to having power. And it did not last. The shift began slowly, not with a scandal, not with a cry, but with the quiet disappearance of a name from conversations. James III grew colder as his court grew louder. He surrounded himself with advisors Margaret did not know. Men who had no titles, no bloodline, but spoke in clipped tones and moved like ghosts through the halls. They rarely bowed to her, rarely addressed her, but they were always near the king. Margaret began to find herself excluded. Invitations no longer arrived for certain meetings. Her place at the council table was left unmarked. When she asked for clarification, the replies were vague. Logistics, security, nothing to worry about. But the message was clear. She was no longer essential. At public feasts, she remained beside the king. But his attention wandered elsewhere. He would murmur to his confidants, pausing only to raise his goblet in rehearsed gestures. Margaret smiled when expected, laughed softly when required. But behind the grace, something inside her began to still. There was a moment, one evening, during a winter banquet in the great hall. Candles flickered across the stone arches. Musicians played a low melody. Margaret rose from her seat and lifted a cup in honor of a visiting noble who had supported Scottish-Danish trade. Her voice rang clear, her words measured and precise. But James did not look up. His hand continued slicing venison, His eyes remained on the plate. When she sat down, the music faltered. The silence that followed was brief, but it cut deeper than any insult. From that point on, the doors began to close. Her chambers were moved, officially, for renovation. In truth, to distance her. The corridors grew quieter. The maids who once dressed her were reassigned. A new set of attendants arrived. They were courteous, efficient, but they did not speak Danish, and they did not ask questions. She noticed that letters took longer to arrive, and longer still to be answered. When she inquired about certain decisions being made in court, the responses were diplomatic but hollow. Her husband, she was told, was handling delicate matters. Foreign influence was being watched closely. It was best for her to rest, to focus on the child, to enjoy peace. Peace had never felt so sharp. One evening, she approached James in the garden. He stood alone beneath a bare-limbed tree, staring out at the twilight. She stopped a few paces behind him, waited. When he finally turned, there was no anger in his face, no cruelty, only distance, as if he had already said goodbye to her in his mind. They exchanged only a few words. She asked if something had changed. He replied that nothing had, and that was the problem. Then he walked past her without another glance. That was the last time she stood beside her king in private. Margaret returned to her chambers that night with a calm expression. She dismissed her attendants early. The fire in her hearth burned low, and she made no effort to stoke it. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the moon rise over Stirling's rooftops. Snow began to fall, soft and quiet, blanketing the world in a silence she knew too well. In the weeks that followed, her appearances became less frequent. When she did appear, the whispers grew louder. Some said she had fallen ill. Others claimed she was with child again. A few suggested her mind was fraying. None of it was true. But none of it mattered. Without access to counsel, without a voice in court, Margaret's presence was no longer a requirement. It became a formality. Her name still appeared in ceremonies, still signed on decrees, still echoed in church prayers. But behind those formalities, her influence was vanishing. The people did not rebel. They did not notice. A queen retreating from view was not a tragedy in their eyes. It was decorum. She had done her duty. She had produced an heir. That was enough. But Margaret was not content to vanish. She tried to reclaim space. She organized small gatherings. She sent letters to foreign courts. She spoke with bishops and requested private audiences. She kept up appearances, clinging to routine with the discipline of someone who knew the edge was near. But at every turn, she was met with the same thin curtain of politeness and delay. Then came the day her Danish handmaid was dismissed. No explanation, no warning, only a folded letter left on the nightstand, written in a language Margaret had never used in private. It thanked the maid for her service and informed her that her presence was no longer necessary. Margaret read it 3 times. Her hands trembled, not from anger, but from recognition. It was the final breath of trust slipping through the cracks. That night, as the castle settled into its usual hush, Margaret stood before her mirror. She wore a gown the color of ash, her hair pinned high. No jewels, no servants, just her reflection, and the knowledge that she had risen as far as they would let her. And now the descent had begun. She began to notice the eyes first, not all at once, and never directly, but in the corners of rooms, at the far end of corridors, just long enough for her to feel it. The maids who once greeted her with curtsies now lowered their gaze. The pages who held open doors began to arrive a few seconds late. The nobles in the chapel pews no longer shifted to make space beside her. It was not hostility. It was subtraction, quiet and methodical. The queen was being erased. At court, she spoke less, not from fear, but from futility. Her suggestions were met with kind smiles and no follow-through. Her requests disappeared into the hands of secretaries who did not return. When she entered the council chamber, conversations slowed. When she left, they resumed. One morning, she passed through the central hall where the banners of Scotland and Denmark once hung side by side. The Danish cloth had been removed. No explanation, no ceremony. Only the bare stone hook remained. When she inquired, the steward replied that it had been damaged during cleaning. No one seemed in a hurry to replace it. Margaret did not protest. She knew the truth. Symbols fall first, long before names. There were whispers now, murmurs that trailed behind her like cold breath, that she wept alone in her chambers, that she spoke in foreign tongues to herself, that she had written to her brother in Denmark requesting to return. None of it confirmed, all of it corrosive. Her ladies-in-waiting were changed. Gradually, one by one, those who had served her since arrival were reassigned or dismissed. Their replacements were efficient, but silent. They answered only when addressed, never looked her in the eye for longer than necessary. They were not cruel, but they were not loyal. When she attempted to speak to the bishop during a Sunday Mass, he bowed and walked past her without pause. She turned to one of the guards and asked for an escort to the king's chambers. He stared a moment too long before nodding. She never made the request again. She began to understand what exile looked like from the inside. Her meals were served later than usual. Not enough to raise alarm, just enough to remind her that timing was no longer hers to command. Dishes arrived lukewarm. Bread grew stale by the time it touched her plate. The kitchen staff never came to explain. When she asked about the delay, her attendants responded with practiced confusion. No one claimed responsibility. No one seemed to notice the pattern. In the hallways, conversations ceased when she approached. Doors closed before she could enter. Scrolls were hidden beneath sleeves. Smiles tightened like drawn strings. Something moved beneath the surface of the court, and it moved without her. Rumors reached her in fragments, that she had a Danish lover kept in secret, that she prayed in the old ways, invoking foreign saints, that she was meddling in affairs of state without the king's approval. Even that she spoke to her son of escape. The last rumor stung the deepest, because it was half true. She had once held James's tiny hand by the window and whispered stories of her homeland. Not escape, memory. The boy had been her light, but even that began to dim. She was no longer permitted to attend his lessons. His tutors changed. His time with her shortened. When she asked the reason, she was told the prince required a stricter schedule, more suited to a future monarch. She was offered short visits, supervised by a governess who never removed her gloves. Margaret did not weep. She had passed the point of outward grief. What remained was a weight beneath the ribs, a pressure that neither sleep nor prayer could soften. One evening, she stood outside the royal chapel, waiting for the king. He had sent word that he would meet her there. She waited for over an hour. Candlelight flickered across the stone. Her shadow stretched long across the floor. When the doors finally opened, it was not James who entered, but a courier. He handed her a sealed document. No wax, no emblem, just a folded page with the words written in neutral Latin. The king regrets. His time is occupied. Perhaps another day. There was no other day. She began to speak less, not because she had nothing left to say, but because there was no longer anyone left to hear it. Even the architecture turned against her. Corridors once warm with footfall now echoed hollow. Windows once filled with sunlight were shuttered. The walls of Stirling seemed to lean inward, as if conspiring with the silence to erase her altogether. She wandered the library one afternoon, looking for a book she remembered from her first year. It had been a gift from a Danish bishop, bound in green leather, lined with gold. She searched for an hour. The shelves had been rearranged. The book was gone. When she asked the steward, he replied that the collection had been reviewed for relevance. Foreign volumes were being removed and relocated. He offered to find her something more appropriate. She declined. Margaret returned to her chambers and stared at the fire until it burned out. It was in this quiet decay that she received the final summons. A formal letter, bearing the royal seal, but lacking the warmth of any human hand. Her presence at court functions would no longer be required until further notice. No explanation, no courtesy, only decree. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her prayer book. The next morning, she did not leave her room. Not for mass, not for meals, not even for the child's passing laughter heard faintly from the garden below. In the afternoon, a maid knocked once and entered. She found the queen seated by the window, her posture perfect, her hands resting in her lap. The maid curtsied, placed a tray of food beside her, and withdrew without a word. Margaret did not touch the food. She did not rise. She watched the sky grow dark and said nothing. The decline was not sudden. It arrived like mist over the moors, creeping in while no one was watching. At first, it was her appetite. Meals untouched. Trays returned as they arrived. Bread grew hard on the table beside her. Fruit darkened in its bowl. The servants began bringing smaller portions, then only broth, then nothing at all unless asked. She did not ask. Then came the nights. Sleep slipped away from her like a shawl falling from the shoulders. She lay awake, staring at the carved beams above her, counting the cracks, the knots, the places where spiders built their kingdoms undisturbed. The hours passed in silence. She stopped lighting candles. She stopped turning the hourglass. She waited for morning without expecting it. Her body thinned. Her hands, once graceful and still, began to tremble. Her skin paled beyond what the Scottish sun had allowed. Dark circles bloomed beneath her eyes. She coughed, softly at first, then harder. A sound that echoed through the stone chamber like a dying bird flapping against glass. No physician came. The royal court claimed she had requested privacy, that she preferred solitude, that she was praying. The truth was simpler. No one had asked. Margaret began to speak to herself, not aloud, but in whispers. She would sit by the window and murmur names: Christina, James, Christian, the names of those far away or already gone. She pulled threads from her sleeves and twisted them around her fingers until they left lines in her skin. Her world narrowed. She moved only between three places: the bed, the chair by the window, the hearth. Her gowns hung untouched in the wardrobe. The mirror remained covered. She avoided her reflection the way one avoids a closed door with something terrible behind it. One day, she found a small piece of cloth, soft and worn, from a garment once belonging to her son. She folded it carefully, placed it on her lap. For hours, she sat with it, her fingers tracing the edges. That night, she held it to her chest and did not sleep. She began to speak to someone who was not there. The attendants noticed. They did not ask. They did not interrupt. They simply left the room a little faster, stood a little farther from her chair. Sometimes, they caught her smiling faintly while whispering toward the fire. Other times, she tilted her head as if listening to footsteps no one else could hear. She called the voice Christina. They assumed it was a memory, or a ghost, or madness. One evening, the maid entered with a fresh blanket and found the queen sitting on the floor beside the hearth. Her hands were stained with ash, her lips moving. There was no fire, only cold stone. When the maid asked what she was doing, Margaret looked up and answered calmly. She said she was waiting for her mother to arrive from the north. No further explanation followed. After that, the attendants kept their visits short. The food was left at the door. The linens changed quickly. Conversations avoided. The queen became a presence to be managed, not understood. A fading figure behind a wooden door, wrapped in silence and dust. The cough worsened. It hollowed her chest, bent her posture, left red flecks on the rim of her cup. Still, no physician was summoned. It was said she refused them, that she feared medicine, that she preferred divine will. These were excuses, convenient and quiet. The truth was simpler. No one wanted to witness her dying. The wind outside grew harsher. Winter clenched its teeth. Ice rimmed the window panes. Inside, the hearth remained unlit. Her fingers stiffened. Her voice softened. She no longer whispered names, only fragments of songs from childhood, drifting in and out like breath on cold glass. One night, she tried to write a letter. The ink froze at the tip of the quill. She folded the empty page and placed it beneath the pillow. Not out of hope, but out of habit. The days became indistinguishable. Light and dark blurred. Time no longer came in hours, only in shifts of cold. Sometimes she would wake with the sound of footsteps in her mind, only to realize no one had entered. Other times, she opened her eyes to see snowflakes gathering on the inside of the window, as if the world itself had forgotten which side she lived on. The servants stopped knocking. They left trays outside. They removed them without checking if anything had been touched. The queen's presence became a matter of routine, not reality. Stirling Castle moved on. Its stone walls absorbed her silence like breath into fog. Courtiers spoke of taxes and treaties. The king held meetings behind closed doors. No one asked if Margaret was well. And still, she endured, until her voice began to vanish, She tried to call for water once. The sound barely crossed the room. She tried again. The syllables cracked in her throat like frost on thin glass. She closed her mouth and did not open it again that day, or the next. The silence, once a cloak, had become a grave. Her final days came not with pain, but with weight. The weight of breath that no longer reached the chest. The weight of blankets too heavy for her arms. The weight of memories pressing against the inside of her skull, dimming, receding, until even her son's name felt foreign in her mouth. One morning, she woke and did not rise. She watched the light shift on the ceiling. She listened for the voice that no longer came. Her hands folded loosely across her chest. Her lips parted. No more bread. No more words. No more name. No one came to wake her. The sun rose behind the clouds, its light slipping through the narrow window in threads too weak to warm the room. Outside, the castle stirred with the rhythm of another day. Hooves clattered in the courtyard. Bells rang for morning prayer. Bread baked in the lower kitchens. Doors opened. Doors closed. But not hers. Behind the locked chamber, the queen lay still. Her body curled toward the cold hearth, arms wrapped around a folded tunic no larger than a hand. Her cheek rested against the wooden floor, eyes half closed, not in agony, not in violence, just in stillness so deep it forgot to end. The fire had gone out 2 nights before. No one had relit it. The guards had stopped checking. Her name was no longer called during morning announcements. The servants who once lingered now came and left quickly. Meals left at the door were untouched, but no longer replaced. The silence had become an answer in itself. It was the 3rd day when someone knocked. A junior maid, sent not by command, but by habit, stood at the door with a tray of watered wine and dry bread. She waited. When no voice replied, she turned the handle and entered. The air inside struck her first, heavy, stale, cold. She took 1 step in, then stopped. Margaret's body was not in the bed. It was beside the hearth, knees slightly bent, hands frozen in their last grip around the fabric. Her head leaned against the stone wall. Her lips parted, her skin pale enough to blend with the marble of the chamber. The maid did not scream. She backed out slowly, leaving the door ajar. Down the corridor, she whispered something to the steward. The steward nodded. 2 guards were summoned. They entered the chamber without speaking. One placed 2 fingers beneath the queen's jaw. Nothing. They wrapped the body in a thin white sheet and carried it out before the sun reached its peak. There was no procession. No black cloth draped over the courtyard. No tolling of bells. No priest summoned to offer last rites. The queen was taken through the servants' corridor, beneath the old arches, where shadows outnumbered torches. Her sheet brushed the stone as they turned each corner. No one followed. No one waited. A chamber at the rear of the chapel had been cleared. It was small. Dust lingered on the windowsills. A single candle flickered beside a wooden bench. That was where they placed her. The steward wrote a notice for the royal ledger. The ink dried slowly in the cold. Her husband did not appear. James III received the news in his private study. He did not pause his writing, did not stand. The messenger bowed and withdrew without further word. That evening, the king dined alone. A page reported that he did not speak, that he stared into the fire longer than usual, that he finished his meal, wiped his hands, and returned to his maps. The next morning, a burial was arranged. Not at the royal crypt, not in the cathedral. A quiet plot beside a moss-covered wall behind the chapel. The gravediggers were local, paid in coin and silence. They worked quickly. The earth was cold and reluctant. The stone marker was plain. No inscription, no date. Only the name, Margaret. No titles. No crown. The grave was never visited by the king. No wreath was laid. No candle burned past the day of burial. No state mourning was declared. The court wore no black. Life continued within the walls of Stirling, as if the cold had taken nothing more than a whisper. The Queen had been fading for so long that by the time she disappeared, there was little left to mourn. The chapel door remained shut. James IV, her son, was too young to understand. He asked once why his mother no longer joined him in the garden. The governess answered with a quiet smile and said that the Queen had gone to rest in heaven. The boy did not ask again. Years later, when he walked those same stone halls as king, the memory of her voice came only as faint echoes, a lullaby in a language he had forgotten, a gentle hand on his forehead during fevers, a shadow retreating behind a closing door. When he began renovations on Stirling Castle, architects presented plans to repurpose the Queen's wing. It had fallen into disuse. Damp crept in through the walls. The wood had softened with time. No one had lived there for years. With a signature, he approved its removal. The rooms were demolished. The hearth where she had sat was broken apart with hammers. The window through which she had watched the snowfall was sealed with stone. Dust clouded the air as the past was reduced to rubble. No one recorded what had been there. No one saved the cloth she had held, or the chair that bore the last shape of her body. She vanished twice, once in life, and once in memory, but the walls remembered. On cold nights, when the fire burns low and the castle grows quiet, some servants claim to hear footsteps in the old corridors. Light ones, measured, a rustle of fabric, a whisper of a name that never finishes being spoken. The tapestries have changed. The portraits that once lined the halls now bear different eyes, different hands, different stories, but none of them are hers. There is no likeness of Margaret in the royal galleries. No statue in her honor. No chapel bearing her name. She left behind no scandal, no rebellion, no monument. Only silence. And yet, silence is the one thing stone does not forget. The queen who came across the sea for peace. The girl who married a country before she learned her husband's name. The woman who gave Scotland an heir and received exile in return. Her voice may be gone, her letters may be dust, but the walls remember what names forget. Some nights, when the castle is empty and the fire has died, a coldness returns to the stones of Stirling, a hush not born of weather, but of presence, as if someone is waiting still. Not for rescue, not for revenge, but to be seen. If her silence still echoes through these corridors, if the frost on those forgotten windows still speaks of a name uncarved in stone, then do not look away. The throne remembers, and now, so do you.